You're 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to win a lottery jackpot. But one man defied those odds, winning the lottery not just once, but 14 times. But how? With those odds, that should be impossible, right? Not when you're as smart as he is. He spotted a loophole in the system and used it to his advantage. But this story isn't as simple as it seems. We not only know how he did it, but we also know what happened next, and it's pretty mind-blowing. Here's the incredible story of the man who beat the lottery 14 times. This story goes back much further than you probably expected. It starts in the 1950s in communist Romania. That was a harsh place to live at the time. The country was suffering from food shortages and most people couldn't get jobs. Even worse, most people had no way out. But one person who was determined to get his family out of that miserable place realized that the easiest way out was to play the lottery. But not in the normal way. That man was Stefan Mendel. He was a mathematician and economist, which probably explained why he had the smarts needed to beat the lottery. But his intelligence and qualifications weren't exactly helping him survive in any other way. Despite his skills, he was only earning a monthly salary of about $88. That's nowhere near enough to support a family, and they were struggling to survive. He wasn't going to sit back and do nothing while his family starved. The best way to do that was to leave the country. But to do that, he'd need a lot more money than he had to spare. So he came up with a plan. He used his knowledge of mathematics to come up with a principle that guaranteed him a jackpot win. We know what you're thinking. That doesn't exist. The lottery is a game of chance only, right? Not quite. There is one way to beat it. And it's actually surprisingly simple. Stefan needed to buy millions of tickets, each with a different set of numbers on it to cover all possible combinations. If you have all the combinations, you're guaranteed to have the winning ticket. But there's one big problem with that. If the lottery game requires you to pick 6 numbers out of 40, for example, that means there are 3,838,380 possible combinations. Now imagine each ticket costs $1. If Stefan wanted to buy 1 ticket for each of those possible combinations, it would cost him almost $4 million. We don't know exactly how the Romanian lottery he wanted to play worked at the time, but it would have probably been pretty similar to that. So where would he get all that money to buy that many tickets? He was smart enough to come up with a plan for that too. All he needed to do was convince other people that he was guaranteed a win. Stefan calculated how big the jackpot needed to be to guarantee he'd make a profit after buying all those tickets and paying taxes on the winnings. Then he contacted people, telling them that if they invested in his plan, they were guaranteed a profit. Stefan would make sure that everyone got a cut that matched the size of their investment. And best of all, they weren't breaking a single law. And it worked. But that doesn't mean Stefan became rich overnight. After paying the taxes on all the winnings and splitting the profits among all the investors, he was left with only around $3,700. That's not a lot after winning a lottery jackpot, but it was enough for something very important. He had just enough money to convince authorities to let him and his family leave Romania. Of course, the story isn't over yet. He'd got the important thing he was aiming for, but now he knew how to beat the lottery. And that's not something you just forget. He eventually relocated to Australia with his family. And here, now everyone was safe, he decided to start making some real money. But just because he had a guaranteed winning formula, that doesn't mean this was easy money. It was a huge logistical challenge. How do you fill out millions of tickets without making even one mistake when covering all possible number combinations? After all, if you do make even one mistake, there's a chance that would have been the winning ticket, if only you hadn't marked the wrong number on it. Luckily, Stefan's incredible brain came to the rescue again. Back in those days, it was possible to buy lottery tickets to print at home. That helped Stefan out a lot. He was smart enough. He figured out how to program printers to print each ticket with a different set of numbers until he had every possible combination. It was genius, but it was still going to cost money. Again, he started contacting the right people. Each one only needed to give Mendel a few $1,000s. All those small bits added up until Mendel had millions of dollars in investment money. But this time, it wasn't just to buy tickets. He made sure he had some extra to set up his advanced ticket printing facility. Then his syndicate would take the millions of tickets around to multiple shops to officially buy them. But they weren't playing every time. Stefan's mathematics knowledge was useful in working out when to play. He would only use this strategy when the jackpot prize reached more than 3 times as much as it cost to buy the tickets. That way, he guaranteed that he'd cover the costs of the tickets and other things he needed to pay for, like admin costs and assistants, and all the investors in the syndicate would be guaranteed to make a good profit on their investment. And of course, it worked. The syndicate just kept winning. They were now calling themselves the International Lotto Fund, and they played lotteries in the UK and Australia throughout the 1960s and 70s, working together to win over and over again. And because the system kept working, Stefan and the other members of the syndicate were able to convince more and more people to join. After 12 big wins in Australia, the syndicate decided to move on to their biggest plan yet. They were going to break America. But it wasn't that simple. The countries they'd been playing in so far didn't have as many lotteries to choose from. America, as you know, has loads of different lotteries, and each one is a little different. You might be wondering why that matters. Just go for the one with the biggest jackpot, right? Not exactly. Smaller lotteries often have far less possible combinations of numbers than big lotteries. They're normally simpler too. For example, the small lotteries might work on a simple system, like picking 6 numbers out of just 40, which we know means it will have a little less than 4 million combinations. But the bigger lotteries are more complicated. Stefan's syndicate was investigating American lotteries in the early 90s, and it was a little different back then. But today, for example, the Powerball lottery tells you to pick 5 numbers out of a possible 69 plus the Powerball, which is another choice of 1 number out of a possible 26, which also needs to be correct. What that means is you're left with over 11.2 million possible combinations. That also means you'd need to buy over 11.2 million tickets to cover all of those possible combinations. These big lotteries also typically cost more money to play. It's currently $2 to play the Powerball lottery. That would mean all those Powerball tickets would cost the syndicate almost $23 million. That's a lot more money than the $4 million they were investing before. So choosing the right lottery was crucial. They needed to pick one that had a big jackpot, but that they could also afford and would actually give them a good profit on what they invested. Luckily, Stefan had the skills to weigh up these options. His economic skills helped him narrow down the perfect lotteries for the syndicate to play. And in the end, he chose the Virginia lottery. It only asked players to pick numbers between 1 and 44, which meant the amount of possible combinations wasn't too high. But the jackpot was. By now, the syndicate had a pretty smooth operation going, but it was still a big challenge. They had 16 employees working for 3 months to monitor the printing of millions of tickets for the Virginia lottery, from overseeing the ticket printing through to sharing the winnings with the other syndicate members. However, something was about to happen that he hadn't planned for. After the 7 million tickets were all printed at the syndicate headquarters in Australia, they were all packaged into packs of 10,000 tickets and shipped off to an associate in America. Then the syndicate waited until the jackpot grew to the right size. Then on February 12, 1992, it was announced that the Virginia lottery jackpot was $15.5 million. Now was the time for the syndicate to put their plan into action. The real challenge was still coming. Although the syndicate could print the tickets themselves, those tickets still needed to be purchased and processed correctly at an authorized retailer to count in the lottery draw. But that's not as simple as it sounds. Imagine walking into a store with 7 million tickets and bags full of cash for processing. It just wasn't possible. The syndicate had planned for this though. By now, they knew what they were doing. They had hired the American accounting firm Lowe Lipman to help them handle this huge purchase. They transferred the millions of dollars of investor funds from Australia to an American bank, who then issued the syndicate with tons of cashier's checks, each worth $10,000. These were all handed to a syndicate associate in the US, a man named Anthony Alex. Alex was an ex-Rolls-Royce salesman who'd just got out of bankruptcy court with $400,000 in debt. He was looking for a quick way to turn his fortunes around, and it looked like getting in on this lottery scheme was the best way to do it. He was tasked with the logistics in the US and quickly sent out 35 employees of the syndicate. These were no ordinary people they picked off the street. They were all accountants, handpicked by syndicate members for their skills and reliability. They would take stacks of lottery tickets along with the cashier's checks to hundreds of different stores and gas stations in Virginia for processing. But they had only 72 hours to complete this monumental task. And that's where the problem came in. The store clerks would have to scan thousands of tickets brought in by the syndicate couriers before processing the payment. It was hard work for cashiers. Imagine you were handed 700,000 tickets for processing, like one Farm Fresh employee. Just before ticket purchases closed, some overwhelmed employees left out a stack of 140,000 tickets. That means all those tickets were never processed and wouldn't count. As you've probably guessed, that could easily spell disaster for the syndicate. That meant there were now 140,000 chances that the jackpot winning number combination was left on a store counter, and all their hard work and millions of dollars in investment would mean nothing. You can only imagine how stressful it was for them to watch that lottery draw, knowing there were so many chances they could fail despite their foolproof plan. They gathered together in a business park in Virginia, which had been their headquarters. Then they watched as the numbers were counted out, and the warehouse erupted. They'd won, but it wasn't just the $15.5 million. In the time between when the jackpot was announced and the draw took place, the jackpot had grown to a whopping $27 million thanks to ticket sales. Not only that, but Stefan's syndicate were the only winners, which meant they wouldn't need to share that jackpot with anyone else. And that's not all, because it wasn't just the jackpot they were taking home. Remember, they'd bought every possible combination of numbers, well, except for the 140,000 tickets that weren't processed. And anyone who plays the lottery knows that the jackpot isn't the only prize you can win. There are lower-tier prizes too. Some are pretty big, while others feel disappointing when you are hoping for a big win. But when you win almost all of them, like this syndicate did, they can seriously add up. In total, the syndicate had won another $900,000 in smaller prizes to add to their huge jackpot. But the story doesn't end with this victory. Just because everything the syndicate had done was technically legal, that didn't mean the authorities liked it. They were determined to make sure that they'd never have to pay out the money to Stefan and his syndicate. Because he was the leader, it was Stefan who was taken to court by the lottery authorities. They accused Stefan of cheating the system, and an investigation was launched against him that involved an incredible 14 international agencies, including the CIA and FBI. All were working together to determine if he could legally be accused of fraud and manipulation for exploiting that legal loophole he discovered. But the courts disagreed. There was simply no legal reason to convict him or the syndicate of any wrongdoing, and the Virginia Lottery was forced to hand over the money. But this still wasn't a victory for Stefan's investors. There was trouble in paradise, and it was all because of Stefan. Obviously, the court case cost a lot of money, and Stefan was the one in charge of receiving the lottery payout. So he decided he could simply use the money they won on the lottery to pay for the legal costs. But that meant that all of the investors received a lot less money than they were expecting. And of course, they weren't happy about this. They weren't really wealthy people. They were ordinary small business owners and housekeepers. They had invested a lot of money with the belief that they'd gain a big profit from their investment. But in the end, they all received an average of $1,400. Of course, the ones who invested bigger sums got more than that. But even they hadn't made as much as they'd been promised. It got even worse when they found out that Stefan had paid himself a lot more. He called this a consultancy fee, and it was way more than everyone else got. He took a total of $1.7 million, and that's without counting the money he also took as a profit off his investment. He also took the money to cover expenses, which came to a huge total of $2 million. Instead of explaining, he just sent out a message to his investors saying that the situation had changed, and it may not seem like such a hot investment now. That's a pretty cold way to deal with the problem, especially when all these people had trusted him as a leader in a crazy scheme. But those investors might be glad to hear that Stefan found himself in hot water again. You're not gonna believe it, but the scheme that got him in trouble with the law is eerily similar to what happened to the investors in his Virginia lottery scheme. He'd set up another association of investors to acquire land in the beautiful island of Vanuatu, but he hadn't handled the legal side correctly, effectively meaning he'd misled all of his investors. This translates to fraud. 1996, he decided not to show up for the court case, which is yet another crime. It also meant he had agreed, just by not being there, that he didn't want to defend himself in court. He was convicted in 2004 but never went to jail because he was hiding in an oceanfront house in Vanuatu. But last year, in 2023, he returned, saying he had new evidence to defend himself. But he was wrong. The courts rejected his appeal for a retrial, and he's currently considered a fugitive from justice. As if that wasn't enough, he also blew all his cash and was forced to file for bankruptcy back in 1995. His investors probably feel like justice was served. But what about you? You're probably wondering if you could put together a similar scheme to guarantee you win the lottery. Unfortunately, because of what Stefan did, new laws were put in place to stop others copying him. Let's face it, the lottery wouldn't work very well if anyone could do this. So Stefan will be the first and last person ever to work out a foolproof way to guarantee he'd win the lottery jackpot. It's pretty tragic that he lost all that cash though. Want to know how to avoid the same thing happening to you? We've got you covered with the best ever advice for lottery winners from the Shark Tank team. Click here now so you don't end up like Stefan.